Welcome back. My next guest is John Verwoert, a U.S. Army combat veteran from the Korean War. Welcome, John.
Thank you.
So, John, I'm delighted to have you on the program. I know we had the opportunity to meet outside of our town clerk's office not too long ago, and I thanked you for your service. And before we start, I want to thank you again for your service to our country. You know, my dad was also a Korean War combat veteran. He was in the artillery. So on this segment, obviously, we focus in on one of our local veterans here in Rockland County, Clarkstown. And it's an opportunity to really put a highlight and a focus on what our veterans have done in their service. So again, thank you for being here. What I'd like to do is just start off maybe with a little bit about your background, where you were born and where you were raised.
I grew up in the Bronx. I was drafted into the United States Army in 1951. Mm-hmm. And I was 21 years old, which was old for a draftee.
Mm-hmm. What part of the Bronx were you born in?
In Pelham Bay section, near City Island.
Near City Island, okay.
Yes.
And what was, so you were born roughly 1930?
1930, yes.
1930. So what was the Bronx like, just before we get to that, what are your memories of the Bronx back in as a kid growing up? What was that like?
Well, I was always out in the streets mm-hmm. playing stickball mainly. Uh-huh. And touch football in the streets. We were out on the street from 9 o'clock in the morning until dark. Mm-hmm.
How many brothers and sisters did you have?
I had two sisters.
Two sisters? And you lived in the Bronx for how long?
Until I went into the Army at age 21. 21.
And after you got out of the Army, did you end up back in the Bronx or no?
Yes, I moved back in with my parents. I couldn't support myself. Mm-hmm. And I started looking for jobs, and that was a big disappointment, right? Because there weren't many jobs available. Mm-hmm. And then I heard.
But before we get to that, I'm jumping ahead. We'll get to that towards the end. We'll talk about what you did after the service.
All right.
Let's focus on your service. So you're 21 years old. You're drafted into the Army with the Korean conflict that's taking place. So where did you go when you were drafted? Where did you do your basic training?
I had really never been away from home much. Mm-hmm. So I went to New Jersey, Camp Kilmer at first, and I was thrown in with a group of people like I had never met before. And I remember a couple of incidents. A friend of mine was assigned to latrine duty, and the sergeant told him the toilet is plugged up. So my friend asked, "Where's the plunger?" And the sergeant said, "We have no plunger. Take your hand and free that," which he did. That was an eye-opener for me. And then at night, there was another fellow from Brooklyn, a nasty fellow, and he had a switchblade knife. And he said, "Nobody better mess with me. No sergeant better tell me anything to do." And everybody stayed away from the guy. And then we went to sleep. And when he woke up in the morning, somebody had stolen his knife. And he became very docile. So those were my first two recollections. Right. From there, I went to Fort Smith, Arkansas, mm-hmm. Camp Chaffee. I took artillery training.
So a kid from the Bronx, you know, down in Arkansas in 1951. It had to be a very, very different experience.
Well, again, I was thrown in with people from all over the country. And they pushed us very hard. And it was very difficult for me going without sleep. So I had a difficult time in basic training. I found it very hard, harder than Korea, as a matter of fact.
Really? Okay.
Really.
So after basic, where did you end up going?
After basic, they gave us a furlough. They told us we were going to Korea. Mm-hmm. They gave us our orders, so I went home for a week. And then I took a plane with the Flying Irishman. That was an airline at the time. Mm-hmm. Cheapo airline. Mm-hmm. And I flew in a C-47, which was a DC-3 twin-engine plane, mm-hmm. to Seattle. And when we went over the Rocky Mountains, it was like an elevator. I never thought I'd get to Seattle. Mm. That was my first bad experience, but we got there alive anyway. In Seattle, I had to wait shipping out orders. I was there for a month.
Wow.
We were sitting around not doing much.
Mm-hmm.
Then they put us on a troop ship. On the ship, they had stacked bunks. And I noticed that all the guys were sitting around on the first level bunk.
Mm-hmm.
So if that was your bunk, you'd have no privacy at all.
Right.
So I took the uppermost bunk.
Oh, good for you.
And I soon learned that the ship was rocking so much that guys were vomiting. And the guy in the top bunk, the vomit would flow to the lower bunks. So I was fortunate I had taken the top bunk. That was another experience. Then we ran into some severe storms, and I thought the boat was going to sink. One night I went up on deck, and when I looked at the waves, I resigned myself that we were going to drown.
Wow.
I went back below and laid down in my bunk. But we made it to Japan anyway. So we docked in Yokohama. Another experience. I looked off the side of the boat into the water. The water was loaded with jellyfish.
Really?
I had never seen anything like it in my life. You couldn't jump into the water and not fall into all these jellyfish. That was Yokohama. So they kept us in Tokyo for a few days to give us some indoctrination anyway. And they told us another experience. They said, don't mess with the local girls because we found some dead GIs wrapped in barbed wire. That's what the locals did to them.
Wow.
Because they molested the local girls. Another eye-opener. After that, they sent us to Korea. To Busan, they issued us our equipment, rifles. They put us on a train to go up to the front. There were sergeants assigned to the doors of the train. The sergeants had the ammunition. They issued us no ammunition. We all had rifles, no ammunition. And they told us that occasionally infiltrators would shoot up the trains. If that happened, the sergeants would give us ammunition. But there was a problem with guys jumping off the trains and deserting.
Wow.
That's what they told us. They said some fellows had jumped off the train and stowed away on boats and went back someplace anyway. So when the train got up to the front, they issued us our ammo and they assigned us to our outfits. Now, I was assigned to an artillery outfit, a 105 howitzer. And they explained the system over there, which they had a rotation system. If you were in the infantry, you were scheduled to do 9 months on the front, then you would get shipped out. And the artillery was 13 months.
Right.
So I did the entire 13 months. And we were in combat the entire time. But we were shelled. We were never really directly attacked by foot soldiers. And as soon as I got there, I heard artillery shells exploding, so I ran into a bunker, a sandbag bunker. So I'm in there looking out. I see some of the guys are shoveling dirt outside, and they told me, this is the usual artillery fire that haphazardly scatters about. They said, you can't stay in a bunker, you'll be coming out. So I stayed in there for about an hour, and I'm watching these guys digging around, and then I came out.
Yeah.
And mainly, we were filling sandbags, that's what we used. And then they explained everything with the guns, and I was part of a gun crew for about 6 months, and we had a sergeant and 6 other guys. And there was a regular system that we would have to load the ammunition and fire and aim, but we couldn't see anything really because we were in a valley. and we would fire the artillery over the crest of the hill at the enemy.
Right.
And we had a forward observer up front. He was with the infantry. He was a lieutenant. And he would be the spotter. He would see our rounds hit and direct the fire. And he would call a fire direction center on the telephone, and they had a telephone hook up with us. And they would tell us where to aim, elevation and direction. So that's how it was.
And so you were there for 13 months?
13 months. Now, after 6 months, we used trucks to pull the cannon if we had to evacuate or move to a new location. So I became a truck driver after 6 months, mainly. But I still stayed with the artillerymen. I slept with them. And we used to fire a shot at night to keep the enemy on their toes. So while the other guys were sleeping, I would go out to the cannon, load one round, fire a shot. That was to harass the enemy. Everybody did that. And we had 6 cannon in our battery, anyway. Now the fellows that were assigned to the guns, they stayed in one location. They had no means to get around at all. So the only thing they knew was when they moved to another isolated location, that's what they saw of Korea, pretty much.
Right.
But because I had that truck now, they had me transporting troops, ammunition, building materials. I got to travel around, which was interesting. Anyway. Now, another system they had was to combat battle fatigue. After 6 months, you would get a mini vacation in Japan.
Oh.
And they called that resting recuperation. The soldiers called it intercourse and intoxication. So after 6 months, I was able to go to Japan for my little vacation. And that gave me insight into Japanese life. It was interesting. Anyway.
And so after your 13 months, I mean, so you were never really, I mean, you were attacked, but it was mainly artillery.
It was artillery fire, yes.
Artillery fire.
And I was never wounded.
Okay.
But
What rank were you in the
when
Army?
I left, I was a corporal.
A corporal. Yeah. Your service sounds very similar to my dad's. My dad was in the artillery.
I was
in
with the
Korea.
7th Division. What outfit was he with, you know?
He was with, I don't think he was with the 7th Division. I have it at home. I should have checked it before I came in. He had been with the group that was part of Patton's army in World War II, the artillery branch that was over there.
Well, I don't know that, no.
So was it the
It was
8th?
called the Hourglass Division, the 7th Division.
Yeah, I don't think it was his.
But
But
we also had numerous United Nations
right,
contingents over there. We had Canadians, Ethiopians, Colombians,
right.
and they weren't assigned with us, but they fought with us.
But my dad served in the artillery. He did see some direct combat, you know, when they were where, you know, their artillery batteries, you know, was attacked. He ended up as a corporal as well, and he also did 13 months. So very similar.
Very similar, yes.
Very, very similar. I'll have to double check. I'll, you know, after the show, I'll have to, you know, let you know. But so after Korea, you were discharged. You went back. You lived in the Bronx. When did you eventually come up to Rockland County?
In the 60s.
Okay.
Anyway, when I got home, my mother used to listen to the German Hour in German. I don't speak German. So they had an ad in English for the state police. And I wrote it down. I took the test. 6 months later, I was a state trooper
Well, good for you.
in New York. And after a while, I found myself stationed in New City, where Bruno Hairdresser is today, right next to the church. So I was about 5 months in New City. That was interesting. I never thought I'd wind up here
Right.
eventually as a resident. And I met my wife. She was from Brooklyn. She didn't want to marry a state trooper because at that time they could transfer you to Buffalo or Montauk which wasn't good for someone who liked living in Brooklyn anyway. So she persuaded me to take the New York City test. So I took the test in New York City, and after 2 years as a state trooper, I was able to get onto the New York City Police Department. And I stayed 38 years
Wow.
with the New York City Police Department. I retired as a lieutenant. That was in 1993.
Wow.
So I'm retired 25 years now.
Wow. Thank you for your service to in law enforcement as well. That's again, it's very similar story to my dad. My mom was from Brooklyn. My dad was from the Bronx. He was from Zariga Avenue, which isn't too far from.
I worked there. That was
Yeah.
my sector when I was a policeman.
Yeah. So which isn't too far off, from Pelham Parkway area.
No.
My dad was born and raised there, but not too far from St. Raymond's. Lived on Zariga, and similar situation. Also born in 1930, and he served in the artillery. And
Was he on a 105 howitzer?
He was.
So was I.
Yeah, he was.
Because we also had two 40 millimeter and 8-inch. They were behind us.
Right.
You know,
Right. No, he was.
stacking.
Yeah, he was. He was on the 105. Well, John, I want to thank you for your service. We're pretty much out of time, but I want to thank you for your service to our country as a combat veteran in Korea, and I want to thank you, for your service in law enforcement. 40. If I do the math right, you were 38 years in the New York City Police Department,
Department,
and 2 in the Troopers. So you're over 40 years in law enforcement. So you're really somebody that knows an awful lot about service, and I want to thank you for your service to our country and your service to our community as well, and for being such a great guest.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.